The Denver Family Courthouse was a building designed to crush hope. Its gray marble walls seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating an atmosphere of perpetual gloom that matched the emotional landscape of everyone who entered. Emma Rodriguez sat in the hard wooden chair that was far too big for her 3-year-old frame, her tiny feet dangling several inches above the ground. She wore a pink dress that her mother Jennifer had chosen specifically for this hearing, believing that the judge would be more sympathetic to her custody claims if Emma looked adorable and well cared for. But Emma didn't feel adorable. She felt terrified, confused, and desperately alone in a room full of adults who were supposed to love her, but seemed to hate each other instead. The courtroom smelled like old wood, leather-bound law books, and something else, the metallic scent of fear and desperation that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. Emma had been to this courtroom 4 times now, each visit a blur of confusing conversations and angry voices that made her stomach hurt. She clutched her stuffed rabbit so tightly that one of its ears was nearly torn off, the threads stretching and straining under the pressure of her small fists. The rabbit had been a gift from her paternal grandmother, and it was one of the few things that connected her to her father, a man who had once read her bedtime stories and made her laugh until her sides hurt, but who now looked at her with eyes full of pain and anger. Her father, David Garcia, sat on the opposite side of the courtroom with his attorney, a sharp-featured woman named Patricia Hayes who spoke in sharp, cutting tones that made Emma's teeth ache. David hadn't made eye contact with his daughter in 3 days, not since the incident at the last visitation when Emma had accidentally mentioned that her mother had a new boyfriend. He'd become so angry that he'd cut the visit short and driven away without saying goodbye. Emma had stood at the window watching his car disappear, wondering if she had done something wrong, if somehow his love for her was conditional and she had just failed the test. Her mother, Jennifer Rodriguez, sat on the left side of the courtroom with her attorney, a kind-looking man named Robert Chen who wore wire-rimmed glasses and kept patting Jennifer's arm reassuringly. But Emma could see through the reassurance. Her mother had cried so hard this morning before coming to court that her eyes were swollen and red, and no amount of concealer could hide the evidence of her distress. She had held Emma so tightly while getting her ready that Emma could barely breathe, whispering promises that everything would be okay, that the judge would understand, that they would be together forever. But Emma was old enough to sense that her mother's confidence was manufactured, a performance put on for the benefit of the court and everyone in it. The judge, a woman named Patricia Morrison who must have been in her 60s, sat elevated on her bench like a queen on a throne. She had cold gray eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. Her expression was perpetually stern, as if she had seen too much human suffering and had decided that the best response was emotional distance. She wore her black judicial robes like armor, and her voice when she spoke was measured and without inflection, as if she was reading from a script rather than making decisions that would fundamentally alter the lives of real human beings. She had reviewed Emma's case file extensively, which contained pages and pages of accusations from both parents. Jennifer claimed that David was unreliable, prone to missing visitations, and that he sometimes spoke negatively about her in front of Emma. She said he was emotionally unstable, and that his anger issues made him an unsafe parent. She provided documentation of 3 missed visitations and screenshots of text messages where David had called her names that made Emma's teachers tell her that grown-ups shouldn't use such language. David, meanwhile, claimed that Jennifer was manipulating Emma, turning the child against him, and that she had deliberately alienated him from their daughter. He said that Emma's mother had made false accusations against him to improve her own position in the custody battle. He provided character witnesses who testified that he was a devoted father and that his ex-partner was emotionally unstable and vindictive. What neither parent seemed to understand was that their accusations and defenses meant nothing to the person they affected most. Emma didn't care about legal arguments or character witnesses or custody arrangements. She cared about simple, fundamental things. She cared that her daddy used to read her bedtime stories but didn't anymore. She cared that her mommy used to smile more but now cried frequently. She cared that she was being asked, both directly and indirectly, to choose between the two people she loved most in the world. The custody battle had consumed everything. It had started 6 months ago when David and Jennifer's marriage fell apart in what both of them would later describe as a sudden collapse, though in retrospect, there had been warning signs for years. David had been working increasingly long hours at his consulting firm, coming home late and going to bed early. Jennifer had started taking yoga classes that seemed to stretch later and later into the evening. The emotional distance had grown gradually, like rust forming on metal, until one day they looked at each other and realized they didn't know who the other person was anymore. The divorce itself might have been amicable if David hadn't discovered that Jennifer had been emotionally involved with her yoga instructor, and Jennifer hadn't discovered that David had been spending money on things he'd hidden from her. Suddenly, all the hurt and betrayal that had been building up for years exploded outward like shrapnel. They had stopped communicating with any respect or civility. Every conversation became a battle. Every shared responsibility became a negotiation. And Emma, caught in the middle, had become a pawn in a game neither of her parents seemed able to stop playing. Emma's leg bounced nervously as she sat in the courtroom, a habit she'd developed over the past 6 months. The bouncing was a physical manifestation of her anxiety, her body's way of trying to release the tension that seemed to be permanently stored in her muscles. Her kindergarten teacher had mentioned the behavior to her mother, suggesting that Emma might benefit from some anxiety management techniques. But her mother had dismissed the concern, attributing Emma's nervousness to the divorce rather than to anything she was doing wrong. The judge continued to shuffle through papers on her bench, occasionally making notes with a pen that looked expensive and important. She had not once looked at Emma during the entire proceedings. She had made no effort to acknowledge that there was an actual human child in the room, a child with feelings and fears and desperate needs. To Judge Morrison, Emma was merely a subject of the case, a piece of property to be divided and assigned according to the law and the evidence presented by the attorneys. The courtroom was nearly empty except for the essential personnel. There was the court reporter, a woman in her 70s named Margaret who had been reporting on custody cases for so long that she could type the arguments in her sleep. There were the 2 attorneys, each furiously taking notes and occasionally whispering to their respective clients. There was the bailiff, a large man with a kind face who had given Emma a sympathetic look when she'd entered the room. And there were Emma's parents, their body language speaking volumes about the war between them. Emma's social worker, a woman named Sarah who had been assigned to the case, sat in the back of the courtroom. Sarah was young, maybe in her late 20s, and she had a gentle way of speaking that made Emma feel less frightened. Sarah had visited Emma's home twice, both with Jennifer and with David, and had asked Emma questions about how she felt and what she wanted. Emma had tried to be honest, but she had also been aware that whatever she said would be reported back to the court and used in the custody battle. So she had been careful, guarded, unable to fully express the chaos and confusion inside her. The hearing had been going on for nearly 2 hours, and Emma's attention was starting to wane. The adult conversation was boring and confusing, filled with legal terms and accusations that didn't make sense to her. She didn't understand why her parents couldn't just love each other and her, why everything had to be so complicated and painful. She didn't understand why she was being forced to sit here and listen to people she loved tear each other apart verbally. Emma felt like she was drowning, pulled under by currents of adult emotion that she couldn't control or escape. She wanted to scream. She wanted to cry. She wanted to run out of the courtroom and find somewhere safe, somewhere quiet, somewhere where people didn't yell and accuse each other and use her as a weapon in their battles. She was only 3 years old. She should be playing with toys and singing songs and learning about the world. Instead, she was learning that love could be weaponized, that family was fragile, and that sometimes the people who were supposed to protect you were the ones causing the most damage. The rabbit's ear was nearly completely detached now, hanging by a few threads. Emma stared at it, watching it dangle. She felt like that rabbit, broken, barely holding together, desperately in need of repair but unable to fix herself. The morning had been unbearably long, and Emma could feel the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her small shoulders. Judge Morrison had been speaking for what felt like hours about custody arrangements, parental rights, and best interests of the child. Phrases that Emma didn't understand, but that made both her parents sit up straighter in their chairs. Jennifer kept squeezing her shoulder nervously, a gesture that was meant to be comforting, but that actually made Emma more anxious. David stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched so tightly that Emma could see the muscles working beneath his skin. The judge was about to call for a recess when something unexpected happened. The large wooden doors at the back of the courtroom suddenly swung open with a dramatic force that made everyone jump. The sound echoed through the chamber like a gunshot, sharp and attention-grabbing. Everyone turned in unison to see what had caused such a commotion. Emma lifted her head, startled out of her anxious thoughts. What she saw in that moment would change everything. A police officer strode through the doors with a commanding presence that immediately demanded respect and attention. His name was Officer Marcus Chen, and he was tall, broad-shouldered, with kind eyes that held decades of experience in reading people and situations. He wore the navy blue uniform of the Denver Police Department with polished precision, every button gleaming, every crease perfectly aligned. His leather belt creaked slightly as he walked, and his boots made authoritative sounds against the hardwood floor. But it wasn't Officer Chen who captured everyone's attention. It was the dog. An enormous German shepherd walked beside the officer with perfect discipline and athletic grace. The dog's coat was a beautiful blend of black and tan, gleaming like polished mahogany under the harsh fluorescent courthouse lights. His name was Duke, and he was no ordinary dog. Duke was a K-9 unit with 7 years of police training, and his presence in a courtroom was rare and unusual, something that made the entire room recognize that this was not a normal day. Duke moved with the precision of a trained athlete. His massive paws were silent on the hardwood floor despite his size, which must have been around 90 pounds of pure muscle and intelligence. His head was held high, his ears alert and forward-facing, constantly scanning the room and processing information. His dark brown eyes were intelligent and aware, missing nothing. There was something almost noble about the way Duke carried himself, as if he understood the gravity of his role and the importance of this moment. Judge Morrison's stern expression faltered for just a moment, a crack in her professional facade. She had been informed about this possibility before the hearing began. She had read the research about comfort dogs in courtrooms, the studies showing that the presence of a calm, trained animal could help anxious witnesses feel safe enough to access their authentic emotions. But seeing Duke in person was different from reading about the concept in an academic paper. The dog's presence was immediately transformative. Emma's entire body went rigid with surprise, her exhaustion evaporating instantly. Her blue eyes grew to enormous circles, taking up what seemed like half her face. Her mouth fell open in a perfect O of astonishment. Every nerve ending in her body fired at once, creating a sensation that was almost overwhelming in its intensity. The stuffed rabbit dropped slightly in her grip as all her attention shifted to this magnificent creature that had just entered her world. Officer Chen guided Duke forward with calm confidence, moving at a measured pace that was neither rushed nor hesitant. There was a rope leash attached to Duke's collar, but the dog needed no physical correction or guidance. He had been trained to walk beside his handler with perfect heel position, maintaining consistent distance and pace. Every step was deliberate, every movement purposeful. The officer's hand rested gently on the dog's shoulder, not controlling him through force, but rather communicating through subtle touch and unspoken understanding. The other people in the courtroom seemed to collectively hold their breath. The court reporter's fingers froze above her keyboard. The bailiff, who had been standing motionless by the door, leaned forward slightly, his entire demeanor softening. Even the two attorneys who had been engaged in heated legal argument just moments before fell silent, their competitive energy momentarily diffused by the presence of this calm, powerful animal. Jennifer instinctively reached out to grab Emma's hand, a protective gesture born from maternal instinct. But she didn't pull Emma away or try to contain her reaction. Instead, she seemed to understand that something important was happening, something that might be beneficial to her daughter. She held Emma's hand gently, allowing the child to experience whatever this moment would bring. David's expression changed for the first time in hours. The anger and resentment that had been carved into his features softened slightly. His hands, which had been clenched into fists on the table in front of him, relaxed. He watched the dog with an expression that was almost vulnerable, as if some part of him recognized that this animal represented something he desperately needed but couldn't quite name. Officer Chen continued walking Duke down the center aisle of the courtroom, moving with the practiced expertise of someone who had done this many times before. The dog's tail was held at a neutral position, not wagging exuberantly but not tucked in fear either. Duke's breathing was slow and steady, his entire presence radiating calm competence. There was something almost meditative about watching him move, as if his very existence was a lesson in composure and emotional regulation. As they progressed down the aisle, Officer Chen made eye contact with Judge Morrison and gave her a subtle nod. The judge returned the gesture, acknowledging that the situation was under control and that this was an approved and planned intervention. This wasn't a disruption to the proceedings. It was part of a carefully orchestrated plan to help facilitate honesty and emotional authenticity in a case that had thus far been defined by accusations and defensiveness. When they reached the front of the courtroom, Officer Chen guided Duke to a specific position, close enough to the witness area that Emma could see him clearly, but positioned so that the dog's presence wouldn't physically block anyone's view or interfere with the proceedings. The officer gave Duke a subtle hand signal, and the dog immediately lowered himself to a downstay position, his massive body settling onto the cool hardwood floor with practiced precision. Duke's head rested on his paws, his dark eyes still alert and aware, constantly taking in information. His tail had begun to move in a slow, rhythmic wag, not the excited, desperate wagging of a dog desperate for attention, but rather a measured, almost meditative movement that conveyed calm confidence. The dog's entire body language was communicating something profound. I am here. You are safe. You can trust me. Emma felt something shift inside her chest, something that had been tight and knotted beginning to unwind. Her rapid heartbeat slowed. Her nervous system, which had been in a constant state of hypervigilance, seemed to recognize that Duke represented safety and stability. The dog's presence was like an anchor in a storm, something solid and real that Emma could hold on to while everything else in her life felt chaotic and unstable. For the first time that day, Emma smiled. It was a small smile, tentative and wondering, but it was real. It wasn't forced or performed for the benefit of the court. It came from a genuine place of relief and hope. She looked at her mother, then at her father, then back at Duke. The dog's eyes seemed to meet hers with complete understanding, as if he was saying without words, I know you're scared. I know you're confused. But I'm here now, and everything is going to be okay. Judge Morrison leaned back in her chair, watching the interaction with keen interest. She had authorized Duke's presence, hoping it would help, but she hadn't expected the effect to be quite so immediate or so profound. She could see it in Emma's body language, in the way her shoulders had dropped away from her ears, in the way her leg had stopped bouncing. Officer Chen stood beside Duke, his hand still resting lightly on the dog's shoulder, his presence calm and grounding. He didn't speak or make any unnecessary movements. He simply allowed the moment to unfold naturally, understanding that sometimes the most powerful interventions are those that create space for authentic emotion to emerge. The courtroom had transformed. Where there had been conflict and tension and accusations just moments before, there was now something else, a fragile sense of possibility, a moment suspended in time where different outcomes suddenly seemed conceivable. Emma sat in her oversized chair, her hand still held by her mother, but her entire being focused on the magnificent dog who had just entered her life. Emma's heart was beating so fast she could feel it in her throat, creating a rhythmic pounding that seemed to synchronize with the ticking of the large clock on the courtroom wall. She had never seen a dog this big before, never been in the presence of such power and majesty combined with what appeared to be gentleness and care. Duke represented everything that was missing from her life right now: stability, reliability, and unconditional presence. The dog wasn't angry with her. He wasn't fighting with another dog for custody of her. He was simply there, existing in a state of calm acceptance that seemed almost supernatural in its perfection. Officer Chen began to move Duke further into the courtroom, walking him slowly and deliberately toward the front of the room where the judge sat elevated on her bench. The movement was careful and choreographed, as if every step had been planned and practiced. The officer's hand maintained gentle contact with Duke's shoulder, communicating silently with the dog through touch and subtle shifts in body weight. It was clear that this wasn't the first time they had done something like this together. Their connection was evident in the way they moved as almost a single unit, two beings operating with complete trust and understanding of each other. Emma watched every single moment of this approach, her entire body leaning forward in her chair. Her mother's hand tightened slightly on her shoulder, not pulling her back but maintaining a gentle physical connection that said, "I'm here with you." Emma barely noticed her mother's touch. Every fiber of her consciousness was focused on the enormous dog with the intelligent eyes and the powerful body that moved with such grace. As Officer Chen guided Duke closer, the dog's head turned slightly, and his dark brown eyes made direct contact with Emma's blue ones. In that moment, something ineffable happened, something that couldn't be explained by logic or reason, but that both Emma and Duke seemed to understand on a level that transcended human language. The dog's eyes held no judgment, no anger, no confusion. They held only acceptance, understanding, and what could only be described as compassion. Emma felt something inside her chest crack open, like ice breaking on a frozen lake in spring. All the anxiety that had been building up inside her for months, the fear about which parent she would live with, the terror of having to choose between two people she loved, the confusion about why her family had fallen apart, the nightmares that woke her in the middle of the night. All of it suddenly felt a little bit smaller, a little bit more manageable. It was as if Duke's presence was creating a safe container for all of her difficult emotions. Officer Chen continued walking Duke toward the front of the courtroom, moving at a pace that was deliberately slow and measured. He was giving everyone in the room time to adjust to the dog's presence, allowing the animal's calming energy to spread throughout the chamber like ripples in still water. Judge Morrison watched with an expression that had softened considerably from her earlier stern demeanor. Even her gray eyes, which had seemed so cold and distant, now held a glimmer of something that might have been recognition or understanding. The attorneys on both sides had fallen completely silent. Patricia Hayes, David's attorney, had set down her pen and was watching the scene unfold with a look of fascination mixed with something else, perhaps recognition of the humanity in the situation that had gotten lost in the legal maneuvering. Robert Chen, Jennifer's attorney, had removed his wire-rimmed glasses and was cleaning them nervously with a tissue, his eyes never leaving the dog. David had shifted in his seat, his entire body language transformed. The rigidity that had characterized his posture throughout the morning had softened. His hands, which had been clenched into fists, were now flat on the table in front of him. His jaw had relaxed, and the muscle that had been working so visibly beneath his skin was no longer visible. He was watching Duke with an expression that was almost hungry, as if he was desperately seeking something that the dog represented. Jennifer's breathing had changed. She was breathing more slowly, more deeply, as if she too was being affected by Duke's calming presence. Her grip on Emma's shoulder, which had been tense and protective, had become gentler, more reassuring. She was watching the connection forming between her daughter and the dog with an expression of hope mixed with wonder. The court reporter, Margaret, had stopped her frantic note-taking. Her hands rested on her keyboard, but she wasn't typing. Instead, she was watching Emma and Duke with an intensity that suggested she understood she was witnessing something significant, a moment that transcended the normal business of court proceedings. Margaret had been reporting on custody cases for so long that she had become somewhat hardened to the emotional components of these situations. But something about this moment was piercing through her professional detachment. Officer Chen guided Duke to a specific spot near the front of the courtroom, a location that had clearly been planned in advance. The spot was close enough to Emma that she could see the dog clearly, close enough that she could potentially touch him if circumstances allowed, but positioned so that Duke wouldn't block anyone's view or interfere with the judge's line of sight. The officer was clearly experienced in orchestrating these interventions. Without any verbal command that Emma could hear, Officer Chen gave Duke a subtle hand signal, a slight downward motion that was barely perceptible to anyone who wasn't watching closely. Duke responded immediately, demonstrating the kind of obedience and training that came from years of dedicated work. The massive dog lowered himself gracefully to the ground, his powerful hind legs folding first, then his front legs bending until his entire body was resting on the cool hardwood floor of the courtroom. Duke's head came to rest on his paws, his dark brown eyes still alert and aware, still tracking movement and processing information. His ears were forward-facing, constantly listening to the sounds of the courtroom, the muffled traffic outside, the distant hum of the air conditioning system, the breathing of the people in the room. But despite his alert awareness, his entire body was projecting a message of complete calm and composure. Then slowly, Duke's tail began to move. It wasn't the frantic, desperate wagging of a dog begging for attention or approval. It wasn't the excited, uncontrolled movement of a dog who had just been let off his leash. Instead, it was a slow, rhythmic, almost meditative wag that moved from side to side with perfect regularity. The wagging was like a metronome, like a heartbeat, like the pulse of life itself. It was communicating something profound without using any words at all. Emma watched the tail wag with absolute fascination. She felt her own breathing synchronizing with the rhythm of Duke's tail movement. Her heart rate, which had been racing with anxiety just moments before, began to slow and regulate. The tight knot in her stomach, which had been there since her parents first started fighting months ago, began to loosen. She could feel the tension draining out of her body, flowing out through her fingertips and her toes, dissipating into the air. Officer Chen remained standing beside Duke, his hand still resting lightly on the dog's shoulder. His face was calm and composed, and he made no attempt to call attention to himself or to interrupt the natural unfolding of the moment. He understood that the most powerful thing he could do right now was to step back and allow the connection between Emma and Duke to develop organically, without interference or direction from the adults in the room. Judge Morrison sat back in her chair, her fingers steepled in front of her face, her entire expression transformed from stern authority to something more contemplative and human. She had read the research about comfort dogs in courtrooms. She had authorized Duke's presence in this case specifically because she had recognized that Emma needed something beyond what the legal system could provide. But seeing the effect in real time was different from reading about it in academic studies. The courtroom itself seemed to have changed. Where there had been hostility and tension and adversarial energy just moments before, there was now something else, a fragile sense of possibility, a moment suspended in time where different outcomes seemed conceivable. The room felt quieter, calmer, more conducive to truth-telling and honest emotion. Emma sat in her oversized chair, her hand still held by her mother, her eyes fixed on Duke. The dog's tail continued its steady, rhythmic wag. His dark eyes occasionally glanced toward her, and each time they did, Emma felt a surge of warmth and safety. It was as if the dog was communicating directly with some deep part of her consciousness, the part that understood emotion and safety on a level that transcended words and logic. This was no longer just a custody hearing. This was a moment of transformation, a moment where a small child was beginning to understand that she wasn't alone, that there were beings in the world who could provide unconditional presence and acceptance. Duke, through his simple existence in this room, had created a container of safety within which Emma could begin to access the truth of her experience. Something shifted in Emma at that moment, something fundamental and irreversible. The fear that had been her constant companion for the past 6 months, the anxiety that had become so intertwined with her sense of self that she could barely remember what it felt like to be without it, suddenly seemed to have a place where it could be set down. Duke's steady presence, his calm acceptance, his non-judgmental existence created a psychological space where Emma felt she could finally be herself without performing or protecting anyone's feelings. She looked up at her mother, her blue eyes silently asking permission. Jennifer's expression was complex, a mixture of hope, concern, and a desperate wish to help her daughter find relief from the pain that had been etched into her tiny face. Jennifer nodded slowly, her hand releasing its protective grip on Emma's shoulder. It was a moment of profound maternal sacrifice, letting go of her child, allowing her to move toward something unknown, trusting that this massive dog and the officer beside him meant no harm. Emma stood up slowly, her 3-year-old legs shaky beneath her. The chair she had been sitting in was enormous relative to her size, and climbing down from it required careful coordination. She used her hands to brace herself, sliding forward until her feet touched the floor. For a moment, she stood beside her chair, gathering her courage, summoning every ounce of bravery that a 3-year-old could muster. The entire courtroom fell into a reverent silence. Everyone understood on some level that they were witnessing something sacred, a child finding courage in the presence of an animal, a human being accessing an authenticity that had been locked away by fear and confusion. No one moved. No one spoke. Even Judge Morrison, with all her years of experience maintaining courtroom decorum, made no attempt to stop what was happening. She simply watched, her hands folded on her desk, her expression one of complete attention. Emma began to walk forward. Her small feet made barely audible sounds on the hardwood floor, the whisper of her shoes creating a rhythm that seemed to echo through the chamber. With each step, she was moving away from the familiar, from the adults who had brought her here, from the known dynamics of her life. She was moving towards something that terrified her and comforted her in equal measure. Officer Chen remained absolutely motionless. He understood the delicate nature of this moment and the importance of not interfering. His hand stayed on Duke's shoulder, his breathing remained slow and steady, his face maintained its expression of calm competence. He was a witness to this moment, not an actor in it. Duke's tail wag continued its slow, rhythmic pattern as Emma approached. The dog's dark eyes tracked her movement with intelligence and awareness, but there was no attempt to greet her enthusiastically or to move toward her. Duke had been trained to let the human come to him, to allow the person seeking comfort to set the pace and determine the nature of the interaction. This was crucial. It meant that Emma was reclaiming her agency, making her own choices, moving at her own pace in a context where so much of her life had been determined by adult decisions and adult conflicts. Emma was now just a few feet away from Duke. She could see the rise and fall of the dog's massive chest as he breathed. She could see the texture of his coat, the way the light caught on the tan and black fur, creating patterns of shadow and shine. She could smell him, not an unpleasant smell, but a warm, earthy scent that was completely foreign to her but somehow comforting. It was the smell of something real, something solid, something that existed beyond the realm of adult arguments and legal proceedings. She took the final steps that separated her from the dog and knelt down beside him. For a moment, she simply knelt there, her small body beside Duke's enormous one, and then she did something that would later be described by everyone in that courtroom as one of the most powerful moments they had ever witnessed. Emma wrapped her small arms around Duke's massive neck and buried her face in his fur. What happened next was the complete and utter breaking open of all the emotions that Emma had been holding inside her for months. Her small body began to convulse with sobs, deep, primal, body-shaking cries that seemed to come from somewhere very deep within her core. These were not quiet tears. These were not controlled weeping. These were the sounds of a child finally releasing the unbearable weight that she had been carrying alone. Her mother made a small sound. A gasp or a cry and half rose from her seat, her maternal instinct screaming at her to go to her child. But Robert Chen, her attorney, placed a gentle hand on her arm, and Jennifer understood. Emma wasn't in danger. Emma was healing. This was the sound of a child accessing and expressing emotions that had been trapped inside her, poisoning her from within. David had gone completely still. His face had gone pale, and his eyes were fixed on his daughter with an expression of such profound pain and regret that it seemed like his heart was being physically torn from his chest. He could see, in this moment, what his actions, his missed visitations, his unreliability, his participation in the conflict with Emma's mother, had done to his daughter. He could see the cost of his behavior written on the small body of the child he loved more than anything in the world. Judge Morrison had removed her reading glasses and was pressing her fingers against her eyes. Her stern, professional facade had completely crumbled, and anyone looking at her could see that she was fighting back tears. In 30 years of presiding over family law cases, she had never seen a moment quite like this, the raw, unfiltered expression of a child's deepest pain and fear. Duke did not move. The dog did not try to shake Emma off or step away from her embrace. Instead, he remained completely still, his body becoming a sanctuary, a safe place where Emma could express everything that needed to be expressed. It was as if the dog understood on some level that transcended species and language, that this child needed to cry, needed to grieve, needed to release the pain that had been stored in her tiny body. Duke's tail had stopped wagging. It now lay still beside his body, but there was no tension in his posture, no indication of discomfort. The dog's breathing remained slow and steady, and occasionally he would turn his head slightly to nuzzle Emma gently, his dark nose touching her hair in small gestures of comfort and acceptance. Officer Chen's eyes had become wet, and he made no move to hide it. Tears were streaming down his face as he stood witness to this moment. He had seen Duke work many times before, had witnessed the dog's remarkable ability to provide comfort to traumatized children and victims of crime. But something about this moment was particularly moving. The simplicity and purity of it, the way two beings from different species were communicating through touch and presence what all the lawyers and judges in the world could not communicate through words. The court reporter, Margaret, had her hands over her face, her entire body shaking with silent sobs. She had covered custody cases for decades, had heard countless arguments about which parent was better, which parent deserved more time with the children. But she had rarely witnessed what mattered most, what a child actually needed, and how a child expressed their deepest pain. Jennifer was crying openly now, her attorney's hand on her arm the only thing keeping her from rushing to her daughter. But she understood, at some level, that Emma needed this moment. Emma needed to express her pain without having to take care of her mother's feelings. Emma needed to be the child and not the emotional caretaker in this situation. Emma's sobs gradually began to slow. Her breathing, which had been ragged and desperate, became more regular. Her small hands, which had been gripping Duke's fur tightly, relaxed slightly. She remained nestled against the dog's body, her face still pressed into his neck, but the acute crisis of emotion had passed. What remained was a kind of exhausted calm, the peace that comes after finally allowing yourself to feel everything you've been holding back. Officer Chen stood motionless, his hand still resting on Duke's shoulder, his eyes still wet with tears but his expression steady and present. He understood that what had just happened in this courtroom was far more important than any legal argument, any character witness, any documentation of who had missed what visitation. What had just happened was a child being given permission, through the presence of a trained animal, to be honest about her pain. The silence in the courtroom was profound and complete. It was not the silence of emptiness, but rather the silence of a room holding its breath, waiting for something inevitable and terrifying to unfold. Emma's crying had subsided to occasional hiccups and sniffles, her small body still pressed against Duke's side, her fingers still tangled in his fur. Officer Chen remained perfectly motionless, understanding that this transition moment, from emotional release to potential verbal expression, was delicate and required absolute presence without interference. Minutes passed. Emma simply breathed, her face buried in Duke's neck, her entire being focused on the steady, reliable heartbeat of the dog beside her. Duke's presence had created a container so safe, so absolutely judgment-free, that something inside Emma seemed to be shifting and reorganizing. The anxiety that had been lodged in her chest was beginning to transform into something else. Clarity, perhaps, or resolution, or maybe just the simple fact that she had finally been allowed to feel the full weight of her pain without having to protect anyone else. Judge Morrison slowly replaced her reading glasses on her nose. Her hands were trembling slightly, and she took a moment to compose herself, to gather the professional demeanor that she had momentarily lost. But when she spoke, her voice was different from before. The cold distance had been replaced by something warmer, something more human. Her gray eyes, which had seemed so impenetrable just hours ago, now held a depth of understanding and compassion that hadn't been visible before. "Emma," Judge Morrison said softly, her voice carrying across the courtroom with gentle authority. "When you're ready, sweetheart, would you like to tell us what you're feeling? You can stay right there with Duke. You don't have to move, but I think it would be very helpful if you could share with us what's in your heart." Emma lifted her head slowly. Her face was blotchy and tear-stained, her eyes red and swollen from crying, her nose running slightly. She looked utterly spent, as if she had just run a marathon, as if every ounce of energy in her small body had been exhausted by the emotional release she had just experienced. But there was something else in her expression too, a kind of clarity, a sense of having moved through something terrifying and come out the other side. She nodded slowly, not speaking yet, just acknowledging that she had heard the judge. She remained kneeling beside Duke, one small hand still buried in his fur. Officer Chen gave the dog a subtle hand signal, and Duke shifted his body slightly, angling himself so that Emma was supported against his side, so that she could remain in contact with him while also being able to see and be seen by the people in the courtroom. Emma took a shaky breath. Her voice, when she spoke, was small and fragile but clear, remarkably clear for a 3-year-old who had just experienced such overwhelming emotion. "I'm scared," she said simply. The words hung in the air like bells tolling, each syllable carrying weight and significance. "I'm scared all the time." Jennifer's face crumpled, and her attorney's hand on her arm tightened in a gesture that was meant to be restraining, but that Jennifer barely seemed to notice. David had gone absolutely rigid in his chair, every muscle in his body tensed, his face a mask of pain and realization. "What are you scared of, Emma?" Judge Morrison asked gently, leaning forward slightly, her entire attention focused on the child. Emma paused, gathering her thoughts, searching for words that would express the complex emotional landscape of her experience. "I'm scared when Mommy and Daddy yell," she said. Her voice grew slightly stronger as she spoke, as if articulating the fear was making it less overwhelming. "They yell a lot. They yell about me. They yell on the phone. They yell when they pick me up and when they drop me off." Patricia Hayes, David's attorney, made a small movement as if to object, but Judge Morrison raised her hand sharply, cutting off any interruption. The judge's eyes had narrowed, her expression making it clear that she would tolerate no interference in this moment. This was Emma's time to speak her truth, and nothing was going to interrupt it. Emma continued, her small voice growing more confident. "I hide under my blankets at night and cover my ears with my pillow, but I can still hear you yelling. I can still hear the bad words." She looked directly at her mother. "Mommy, you say Daddy is a bad person and that he doesn't love me. You say he's not safe." Then she turned her head to look at her father. "Daddy, you say Mommy is crazy and that she's trying to take me away from you. You say she's a bad mother." David's face had gone completely white. His attorney was trying to whisper something to him, but he seemed unable to hear her. His entire consciousness focused on his daughter's words, on the weight of what she was saying, on the realization of how deeply his actions had wounded her. "I don't know what to believe," Emma said, her voice wavering slightly but remaining clear. "I love you both. I don't think either of you is bad. I think you're both sad and angry." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice dropped to almost a whisper. "But I don't like the yelling. The yelling makes my tummy hurt. The yelling makes me scared. I can't sleep. I have bad dreams." The court reporter's hands had come to rest on her keyboard, her typing abandoned. Tears were flowing freely down her face, and she was making no attempt to hide them. Margaret had been covering custody cases for 30 years, and she had heard countless accusations, countless arguments about fitness and safety and best interests. But she had rarely, if ever, heard a child articulate so clearly what actually mattered to them, what actually caused them pain. Judge Morrison's jaw had clenched, and her eyes had taken on a steely quality that suggested she was experiencing a profound shift in her understanding of this case. The legal arguments, the documentation, the character witnesses, all of it suddenly seemed superficial and irrelevant in the face of what this child was expressing. "Thank you for being so brave and so honest, Emma," the judge said softly. "Is there anything else you want to tell us?" Emma was quiet for a moment, her small hand still stroking Duke's fur. Then she nodded. "I like Duke because Duke doesn't yell. Duke is soft and nice. Duke just is. Duke doesn't try to make me choose or make me sad. Duke just loves me because I'm here." The simplicity of the statement struck everyone in the courtroom like a physical blow. A 3-year-old had just articulated something that had eluded all the lawyers, all the legal arguments, all the extensive documentation. She had identified what she actually needed: unconditional presence, safety, and freedom from conflict. Jennifer stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Your Honor, I need to say something," she said, her voice shaking. Robert Chen tried to pull her back down, but Jennifer shook him off. "I've been so focused on proving that David was a bad father, on protecting Emma from him, that I didn't realize I was hurting her. I didn't realize that my fighting with him, my anger, my trying to turn her against him, that I was causing her more damage than anything else." David had his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Patricia Hayes was trying to get him to remain composed, but he seemed beyond caring about courtroom decorum or legal strategy. He was simply a father who had just heard from his daughter that his actions had caused her pain. Emma watched her parents with a mixture of fear and hope. She had never seen her father cry before. She had never seen her mother admit that she had made a mistake. Something was shifting in the room, something fundamental and irreversible. Judge Morrison raised her hand, commanding silence and attention. "This hearing is temporarily suspended," she announced. "I want both parents and their attorneys to meet with me in my chambers. Officer Chen, would you mind if Emma remained here with Duke for a few minutes? I think she's earned some peace and quiet." Officer Chen nodded. "Of course, Your Honor, Duke and Emma will be fine right here." As the adults filed out of the courtroom, Emma remained kneeling beside Duke, her small body nestled against the dog's massive frame. For the first time in months, she felt like she could breathe. She had told the truth. She had been heard. And somehow, miraculously, the world hadn't ended. Instead, it felt like it might be beginning again. The courtroom had emptied of adults, leaving Emma alone with Officer Chen and Duke in what suddenly felt like a cathedral of silence. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant, mechanical song above them, and the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the hardwood floor through the tall windows. Emma remained kneeling beside Duke, her small body cradled against the dog's massive frame like a child sheltering in the crook of a mountain. The dog had shifted his weight slightly, repositioning himself to provide maximum support and comfort, his body becoming a living cushion between Emma and the hard reality of the courtroom. Officer Chen had taken a seat a few feet away, respecting the space between Emma and Duke, but remaining present as a quiet guardian. He had done this many times before, sat with traumatized children while they processed their emotions in the presence of his trained partner. He knew the power of this moment, the importance of allowing it to unfold without interference or direction. His job now was simply to bear witness and to ensure that Emma felt safe. Time seemed to move differently in the empty courtroom. Minutes stretched and contracted in ways that didn't follow the normal progression of a clock. Emma's breathing had gradually synchronized with Duke's, and her small heart rate, which had been racing with anxiety just an hour ago, had slowed to a steady, normal rhythm. The dog's presence was like a metronome, regulating her nervous system, teaching her body what calm felt like. In Judge Morrison's chambers, a very different kind of conversation was taking place. The judge sat behind her massive oak desk, her judicial robe still draped around her shoulders, but her expression had completely transformed from its earlier stern formality. She had loosened the collar of her blouse, and there was a vulnerability in her posture that suggested the professional walls she had built over decades in the law were crumbling. Jennifer sat on one side of the room, her attorney beside her but noticeably quiet, allowing his client to speak for herself. David sat on the other side, his face streaked with tears, his entire body language suggesting a man who had just confronted something unbearable about himself and his actions. Patricia Hayes, his attorney, was watching him with a mixture of concern and the recognition that this case had fundamentally shifted, that no amount of legal maneuvering would change what had just been revealed in the courtroom. "I want to apologize," Jennifer said, her voice steady but thick with emotion. "I've spent the last 6 months trying to prove that David was an unfit father, trying to convince Emma that she couldn't trust him, trying to protect her from him. But what I've actually been doing is teaching her that love is conditional, that family is fragile, that people you love can become enemies." David looked up, his eyes meeting his ex-wife's for the first time with genuine openness rather than hostility. "We've both been so focused on winning," he said, his voice raw and broken. "We've both been so angry about what happened between us that we forgot that Emma wasn't the one who hurt us. We were the ones hurting her." Judge Morrison leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful and contemplative. "I want you both to understand something," she said quietly. "What Emma articulated in that courtroom wasn't the coached testimony of a child who had been influenced by one parent or the other. What I witnessed was a child expressing her authentic, unfiltered experience. She didn't say that either of you was a bad parent. She didn't ask to live exclusively with one of you. What she asked for was something much simpler and much more important. She asked for the fighting to stop." Jennifer was crying openly now, her hands covering her face. "I didn't realize," she whispered. "I was so hurt about what happened between David and me that I took it out on Emma. I made her carry my pain." David nodded slowly, his expression reflecting a similar realization. "I did the same thing. When I started missing visitations, it wasn't because I didn't love Emma. It was because seeing Jennifer, having to negotiate pickup times, feeling the hostility between us, it made me so angry and so hurt that I started withdrawing. And the more I withdrew, the more Emma interpreted it as me forgetting about her, not loving her enough." "That's exactly what she said," Judge Morrison confirmed quietly. "She told us that you missed her dance recital, that you missed her birthday party, and that she believes you forgot about her. Those are the words of a child who is experiencing parental abandonment, regardless of the intentions behind it." The judge set down her pen and folded her hands on her desk. "Before I make any custody decisions, I'm going to require several things from both of you. First, you're both going to attend intensive parenting counseling, specifically focused on co-parenting in a way that minimizes conflict and protects Emma's emotional well-being. Second, you're going to engage in family therapy together with Emma, where you'll both need to take responsibility for how your conflict has affected her. Third, Mr. Garcia, you're going to create a schedule that you commit to following without exception. If you cannot be present for something, You communicate that to Emma at least 48 hours in advance, and you provide a clear explanation. David nodded immediately, his entire body language expressing desperate acceptance of these conditions. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said. "I'll reduce my work hours. I'll restructure my entire life if that's what it takes to be present for my daughter." Jennifer reached across the space between them and placed her hand on David's arm. It was the first gesture of connection between them that didn't involve hostility or legal maneuvering. "We can do this," she said softly. "We can be better for her." Judge Morrison observed this moment of connection with careful attention. She had seen too many custody cases where the parents remained locked in conflict indefinitely, where the child became the perpetual casualty of their ongoing war. But something about this moment felt different. Something about what Emma had articulated had penetrated the defensive walls both parents had constructed around themselves. "I'm also going to modify the custody arrangement," the judge continued. "You'll have joint custody with clearly defined responsibilities. Emma will spend equal time with both of you, but that time will be structured in a way that minimizes transitions and maximizes stability. You'll need to communicate with each other directly about Emma's needs, about her school events, about her medical care. And you'll both need to commit to never speaking negatively about the other parent in front of Emma or allowing her to witness conflict between you." Back in the courtroom, Emma remained cradled against Duke, finding comfort in the dog's steady presence. Officer Chen had quietly moved to sit beside her, not touching her but making his presence known. "You did something very brave today," he said softly. "You told the truth about what you're feeling, and that took a lot of courage." Emma looked up at him, her blue eyes still red and swollen but clearer now, more present. "Will Mommy and Daddy stop yelling?" she asked, the question carrying the desperate hope of a child who had been denied peace for too long. "I think they heard what you said," Officer Chen replied carefully. "I think they understand now how much their fighting hurts you. I think they're going to try very hard to be different." Emma turned back to Duke, burying her face in the dog's fur again. But this time, the gesture wasn't about seeking refuge from overwhelming emotion. This time it felt like a gesture of gratitude, of acknowledging that this magnificent dog had given her the safety she needed to speak her truth. Officer Chen watched this exchange with deep understanding. He had seen Duke's work transform many situations, but something about this case felt particularly significant. A 3-year-old had just articulated what family lawyers and judges often struggled to understand, that children don't need their parents to be perfect or to make their relationship work. What children need is safety, consistency, and freedom from conflict. As Emma sat with Duke in the empty courtroom, her small hand stroking the dog's ear, she didn't know that her words had just altered the trajectory of her family's future. She didn't know that she had just taught 2 adults something that no amount of therapy or counseling could have taught them. She didn't know that her honest expression of pain and fear was going to be the catalyst for genuine change. All she knew was that Duke was beside her, that Officer Chen was present, and that for the first time in a very long time, she didn't feel completely alone in her experience. She was a 3-year-old girl who had just been brave enough to tell the truth, and somehow, miraculously, the world had listened. 6 months had passed since that transformative day in Judge Morrison's courtroom. The passage of time had proven to be a powerful teacher, and both Jennifer and David had approached the work of changing their lives with a commitment that surprised even themselves. The changes weren't instantaneous or without difficulty. There were moments when old patterns threatened to resurface, moments when anger and hurt from the past tried to drag them backward into conflict. But each time, they would remember Emma's voice in that courtroom, remember the pain in her blue eyes, remember the way she had clung to Duke for comfort, and they would find the strength to choose differently. David had made radical changes to his professional life. He had reduced his hours at the consulting firm where he had been working, eventually negotiating a part-time position that allowed him to be present for Emma without sacrificing his entire career. More importantly, he had become fanatical about honoring his commitments to his daughter. He set phone reminders for every scheduled event: Emma's school performances, her doctor's appointments, her soccer practice, her tutoring sessions. He created a color-coded calendar that he checked multiple times each day, not out of anxiety, but out of a determination to never again allow Emma to experience the abandonment she had felt when he missed her recital. He had also started therapy, individual therapy that focused on understanding why he had allowed anger and hurt to cause him to withdraw from the people he loved. His therapist had helped him see that his tendency to abandon relationships when they became difficult was a pattern that had preceded his marriage to Jennifer. His parents had divorced when he was young, and he had internalized a narrative that relationships were temporary, fragile, and ultimately unreliable. When his marriage to Jennifer began to struggle, rather than fighting to save it, he had unconsciously recreated the abandonment pattern from his childhood, withdrawing and pulling away until the relationship completely collapsed. Understanding this pattern had been painful but liberating. David began to see his relationship with Emma differently, not as a casualty of his failed marriage, but as a relationship worth fighting for, worth showing up for, worth making himself vulnerable for. He started writing Emma letters, expressing his love and his commitment to being present. He started planning special activities with her, not grand gestures designed to prove his love, but simple, consistent experiences that communicated, "I'm here, I haven't forgotten you, I love you." Jennifer had undergone a parallel transformation, though her journey had been different. Her issue hadn't been abandonment, but rather enmeshment, the tendency to blur boundaries between herself and her daughter, to use Emma as an emotional support system, to make Emma responsible for managing her feelings. She had been so hurt by David's infidelity and his withdrawal that she had unconsciously sought to punish him through Emma, trying to turn their daughter against him, trying to make Emma her ally in the conflict. The co-parenting counseling had been difficult for Jennifer, forcing her to confront how her actions had harmed her daughter. Her therapist had helped her understand that using a child as an emotional support system, even unintentionally, was a form of emotional abuse. It placed an inappropriate burden on the child and robbed them of their right to have their own relationship with both parents. Jennifer had made a commitment to changing this dynamic. She stopped complaining about David to Emma. She stopped asking Emma questions designed to extract information about what happened during visitations. She stopped making critical comments about David's parenting or his character. And most importantly, she stopped using Emma as an emotional support system, instead building her own support network of friends, family, and professional counselors who could help her process her own pain and hurt. The mandatory family therapy sessions had been the hardest part for both parents. Sitting in Dr. Amelia Cross's office with Emma present, being forced to take responsibility for how their conflict had affected her, had been deeply humbling. Dr. Cross had not allowed either parent to deflect blame or minimize their impact. She had insisted that they hear Emma's experience of their fighting, that they understand how frightened and confused their daughter had been, that they genuinely apologize for the pain they had caused. The first family therapy session had been devastating. Emma, feeling safe in the presence of Dr. Cross and the therapeutic environment, had opened up about her nightmares, about waking up in the middle of the night with her heart racing, about being afraid that one or both of her parents would disappear and never come back. She had described hiding under her blankets to escape the sound of yelling. She had talked about her fear that she had caused the divorce, that if she had been a better daughter or a better person, maybe her parents would still be together. Both Jennifer and David had wept during that session. David had taken full responsibility for his missed commitments and his withdrawal from Emma's life. Jennifer had taken responsibility for using Emma as an emotional support system and for trying to turn her against her father. They had both apologized, genuinely and deeply, for the pain they had caused their daughter. The changes in Emma's life had been remarkable. Within the first month of the new custody arrangement and the beginning of therapy, her nightmares had started to decrease. Within 3 months, they had almost completely stopped. Her teachers at school reported that she was more engaged, more confident, and more joyful. She was sleeping better, eating better, and showing fewer signs of the anxiety that had characterized her behavior during the custody battle. But perhaps most remarkably, Emma had developed an unshakable trust in both of her parents' commitment to her. David never missed a scheduled event. When he couldn't attend something, he called Emma 48 hours in advance and provided a detailed explanation. He offered to reschedule with her so that she knew it wasn't her fault that he couldn't be there. Jennifer created space for Emma to have her own relationship with David without interference or commentary. She would often say things like, "That sounds like something fun you'll do with your dad. I'm so glad he's going to be there." 6 months after the courtroom appearance of Duke, Officer Chen received a call from Judge Morrison's office. The judge wanted him to bring Duke to Emma's school for a community safety presentation. When Officer Chen and Duke arrived at the school, Emma came running down the hallway with her entire class behind her, their teacher having gathered the students for this special event. Emma threw her arms around Duke's neck, and the dog immediately went into a downstay, allowing the child to express her affection and gratitude. "Duke," she whispered, her face buried in his fur, "thank you for helping my family." Officer Chen knelt beside them, his eyes wet with tears. "Duke didn't do anything magical," he said softly. "What you did was magical. You were brave enough to tell the truth, and that's what changed everything." Emma's parents were both present at the school event, standing separately but no longer hostile, no longer locked in conflict. They watched their daughter interact with the dog that had helped her find her voice, and they both experienced a profound gratitude, not just toward Duke and Officer Chen, but toward Emma herself, for having the courage to speak her truth even when it was terrifying. The custody arrangement had evolved into something beautiful and functional. Emma spent 3 days one week with her father and 4 days the next week, switching on Wednesday evenings and Saturday mornings. The transitions had become gentle and routine, lacking the anxiety and conflict that had characterized them during the custody battle. Both parents had learned to communicate respectfully about Emma's needs, about her school events, about her doctor's appointments. And though neither parent had remarried or gotten back together, their relationship as partners had fundamentally changed and could not be restored. They had developed something perhaps even more important: a genuine co-parenting partnership built on genuine care for their daughter and genuine respect for each other's role in her life. Emma had started kindergarten, and she thrived. She made friends easily, participated enthusiastically in class, and showed no signs of the trauma that had characterized the previous year of her life. She talked frequently about becoming a dog trainer when she grew up, about wanting to work with dogs like Duke who help people find their courage and their voice. On quiet nights, when Emma was with her mother, she would sometimes ask to look at pictures of Duke. Jennifer would pull up the photos on her phone, and Emma would smile, remembering that day in the courtroom when a magnificent German Shepherd had given her the safety she needed to tell the truth. And on the nights when Emma was with her father, David would tuck her into bed and tell her stories about brave warriors and magical creatures, but always with a new kind of message, that the bravery they needed most wasn't the kind that involved fighting or winning, but the kind that involved being honest, being vulnerable, and allowing yourself to ask for help when you needed it. 2 years had passed since that pivotal day in Judge Morrison's courtroom, when a 3-year-old girl had spoken a truth, so profound that it had reverberated through the lives of everyone who witnessed it. Emma was now 5 years old, tall for her age, confident, and radiating the kind of joy that comes from finally feeling safe and loved by both parents without reservation or qualification. She was in the 1st grade at Riverside Elementary School, where she was known as one of the most well-adjusted and emotionally intelligent children in her class. Her teachers often remarked that Emma had a remarkable ability to empathize with other children, to recognize when someone was struggling, and to offer comfort and support. But the impact of Emma's courage extended far beyond her own life and her family's transformation. The story of what had happened in Judge Morrison's courtroom had begun to spread through the family law community in Colorado. Lawyers who had been present in the courtroom that day had shared the story with colleagues. Judge Morrison herself had given presentations at legal conferences about the power of allowing children to speak their authentic truth in custody proceedings. The research about comfort dogs in courtrooms, which had been somewhat theoretical before, now had a powerful real-world example that demonstrated its effectiveness. Within a year, the Denver Family Court had officially implemented a K-9 comfort program in which carefully selected and trained dogs would be available during custody hearings, particularly in cases involving young children. Officer Chen and Duke became the unofficial ambassadors of this program, and Duke's calendar became filled with appearances at courtroom proceedings. But Duke wasn't just appearing in courtrooms. He was changing lives, one child at a time. The program expanded to other cities in Colorado and eventually to other states. Family law attorneys began requesting that comfort dogs be present during their custody cases. Judges who had initially been skeptical about the propriety of having dogs in formal courtrooms became passionate advocates for the program after witnessing the profound impact that the presence of a calm, trained animal could have on anxious children. Officer Chen received calls and emails from all over the country from lawyers, judges, and social workers who had heard about Emma's story and wanted to implement similar programs in their jurisdictions. He gave presentations at national legal conferences about the intersection of animal-assisted therapy and family law. He trained other officers and handlers in the specialized techniques required to prepare a dog for courtroom work. Duke, despite his age, he was now approaching his 10th year, which was aging in dog years, became a kind of celebrity in the legal world, recognized and celebrated for the transformative work he did. But perhaps the most profound ripple effect of Emma's bravery was more subtle and less visible. Parents who had heard about the case began to rethink their own approaches to divorce and custody disputes. The story of a 3-year-old girl who just wanted her parents to stop fighting, who didn't care about legal arguments or character witnesses, or who won the custody battle, resonated deeply with people who were in the midst of their own family conflicts. A family law attorney in Denver named Michael Rodriguez, no relation to Emma's family, was so moved by the story that he completely changed his approach to his work. He had spent 15 years building a reputation as an aggressive litigator who viewed custody battles as wars to be won at any cost. But after hearing about Emma's case, he began to shift his practice toward mediation and collaborative law. He started telling his clients the story of a 3-year-old girl who had taught a courtroom full of adults that what children actually need isn't someone to win for them. It's someone to help their parents stop fighting. This attorney began to track outcomes in his practice, comparing the results of adversarial custody cases with the results of mediated cases. The data was striking. In the adversarial cases, even when one parent won, the children showed elevated anxiety, behavioral problems, and difficulty adjusting to the new custody arrangement. In the mediated cases, where both parents worked together to create solutions that prioritized the children's well-being, the outcomes were dramatically better. Children were happier, more secure, and showed fewer signs of trauma. Michael Rodriguez became a vocal advocate for changing the culture of family law, for shifting from an adversarial model where parents fought each other to a collaborative model where parents worked together to protect their children from the damage of conflict. He gave presentations about Emma's case at bar associations and legal conferences, using her story as a catalyst for broader conversations about how the legal system could better serve the interests of children. Judge Patricia Morrison continued her work in family court, and she made a point of always asking herself, when making custody decisions, what would Emma say? She would imagine the 3-year-old girl in her courtroom, articulating what she actually needed, and use that as a touchstone for her decisions. She began to require more parenting education and co-parenting counseling in her custody orders, recognizing that the real issue in most custody disputes wasn't which parent was objectively better, but rather how both parents could work together to minimize conflict and protect their children from emotional harm. Dr. Amelia Cross, the family therapist who had worked with Emma and her parents, began to specialize in post-custody therapy and co-parenting support. She developed a curriculum based on Emma's case, a training program for therapists that taught them how to help parents understand the real impact of their conflict on their children. She wrote articles for professional journals, contributed to textbooks on family therapy, and became a nationally recognized expert on the intersection of divorce, conflict, and child development. Sarah, the social worker who had been assigned to Emma's case, was so moved by what she had witnessed that she decided to go back to school to get her master's degree in social work, with a focus on family systems and trauma-informed practice. She wanted to expand her ability to help children and families navigate the devastating impacts of conflict and divorce. She eventually became a trainer for other social workers, teaching them how to recognize signs of parental conflict trauma in children and how to intervene compassionately and effectively. Margaret, the court reporter who had cried in the courtroom as Emma spoke, had worked in family court for over 30 years, but Emma's case reinvigorated her sense of purpose. She began to attend professional development workshops about child development and trauma. She started a blog where she shared anonymized stories from her work in family court, always emphasizing the perspective of the children involved and what their experiences revealed about what the legal system should prioritize. Back in Emma's life, her transformation had continued to deepen. At 5 years old, she was emotionally articulate in a way that seemed far beyond her years. She understood that her parents had made mistakes, but she also understood that they had worked hard to change and that their love for her was genuine and unwavering. She had developed a close relationship with both parents, feeling equally safe and loved with each of them. Emma's father had remarried a kind woman named Sarah who had no children of her own but who treated Emma with genuine affection and respect. Emma had a stepmother now, but importantly, Jennifer had not felt threatened by this development. Instead, she had welcomed Sarah into Emma's life, recognizing that more loving adults in a child's life was always a positive thing. Emma's mother had also begun to build a new relationship, this time with a man who shared her values and her commitment to creating a peaceful, stable home environment. Emma had met him, and while she was still getting to know him, she could sense her mother's happiness and stability in a way that had been absent during the painful years of the custody battle. Most importantly, Emma had internalized a crucial lesson that would shape the rest of her life, that telling the truth, even when it's scary, even when it might disappoint the people you love, is not only acceptable, it's essential. She had learned that her voice mattered, that her perspective was valuable, and that the adults in her life had a responsibility to listen to her and to prioritize her well-being. Emma still talked about Duke. She had learned to read, and one of her favorite books was about a police dog who helped people. She had created drawings of Duke that decorated both her mother's home and her father's home. She had asked if she could volunteer at the animal shelter when she got older, and both her parents had enthusiastically supported this interest. Officer Chen had brought Duke to Emma's 6th birthday party, and the dog had patiently allowed all of Emma's friends to pet him, to take pictures with him, and to listen to Emma tell them the story of how Duke had helped her family. For a 5-year-old, Emma told it with remarkable clarity and emotional accuracy, emphasizing not what Duke had done, but rather how his presence had made it safe for her to express what she was feeling. Judge Morrison had written a book about her experiences in family court, and Emma's case featured prominently in it, though identifying details had been changed to protect her privacy. The book became required reading in family law programs at several universities and helped shape the next generation of lawyers' understanding of the real impact of custody disputes on children. The ripples continued to expand outward, touching lives in ways that Emma herself would never fully know. Her courage that day in the courtroom had not just saved her own family. It had potentially saved countless other families by changing how the legal system approached custody disputes and by shifting the cultural narrative about what matters most in family law. And at night, when Emma fell asleep, she often dreamed of Duke, not as a dog but as a symbol of safety, acceptance, and unconditional presence. She dreamed of a world where people listened to children, where conflicts were resolved with compassion rather than combat, where families could be broken and still be healed. Emma had become, in many ways, a small but powerful voice for change. At 5 years old, she had spoken a truth that had resonated through the family law system and beyond, reminding everyone who heard her story that children don't need their parents to fight for them. They need their parents to stop fighting and to love them, consistently, reliably, and without conditions. The legacy of that day in Judge Morrison's courtroom would continue to unfold for years to come, in ways both visible and invisible, touching the lives of children and families who would never know Emma's name but whose lives would be forever changed by the ripples of her courage and her truth.